Hello, Cavalier fans. It's Bob Schmidt, your host of the Fear the Fro podcast. But today I am doing this YouTube. I don't know if tutorial is the right word. That sounds kind of smug, but it's just an exploration of Ty Jerome and his impending free agency. The reason I'm doing this is simple. I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I still see a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of fear mongering, a lot of definitive statements of the Cavaliers can't keep Ty Jerome because they're a second apron team. And my belief, my thesis is that could not be further from the truth. And my goal here today is to show my work. So this video is entitled, Ty Jerome, What Next? Now, the purpose of today's video is going to be three things. First, I want to do what I would call the math lesson. You've heard much of this before, but I'm going to give you more specifics, set against the backdrop of the current financial situation we're in now, as opposed to when we talked about it prior in the season when we didn't know that we would be a second apron team. The second thing is what I call the historical precedents. That's looking back on previous examples of guys whose circumstances somewhat mirrored Ty Jerome as an indicator of what history has happened to have play out in regards to early bird rights free agency. And then the third, the most fun part perhaps, is an exploration of the upcoming market and the teams that I perceive to be threats or risks in terms of Ty Jerome being poached in unrestricted free agency. So let's get into this thing, shall we? First, the math. As the Cavaliers head towards this summer, projected to be well into the second apron, they have two free agents which are likely priorities for them to retain. The first is Ty Jerome. The second is Sam Merrill. Debatably, you could put Tristan Thompson in there. He's also a free agent. But for the sake of this example, I'm only talking about two guys because they have a distinct difference which is relevant here. Sam Merrill is in possession of what's called bird rights, or rather the Cavaliers are in possession of Sam Merrill's bird rights. Bird rights are something that a team possesses, which allows them to retain a player over the salary cap if he's been on their roster for 3 years or more. Sam Merrill is in the final year of a 3-year contract. He has bird rights. Ty Jerome does not. When he came here from Golden State, he signed a 2-year, $5 million deal, and he is in the second year of that deal. They possess what are called early bird rights. Now, early bird rights are still advantageous to a team who possesses them, just not as advantageous as bird rights. Early bird rights do allow you to go significantly over the cap, but there are guardrails. There's essentially a ceiling to which you can pay a player, and the risk there is that if an outside team has more money than that to give your player, then he may bypass your early bird offer in lieu of a financially better offer from the outside. So let's discuss this as it relates to Ty Jerome. When Ty Jerome hits free agency this summer, the Cavaliers will have two main offers that they can put before him. The first is up to 175% of his prior year's salary as a first-year salary. In the case of Ty Jerome, he did not make a lot of money last year, $2.56 million. Now, when you do the math, you multiply that figure by 175%, and you come up with a figure of roughly $4.5 million. Now, is Ty Jerome worth more than $4.5 million? I would say almost certainly. Now, the second option, option B, is the 105% rule. This one is way more beneficial in the Cavaliers' specific circumstances because as opposed to it being anchored to what Ty Jerome's previous salary was, it is instead anchored to what the NBA league average salary is. You can pay Ty Jerome a first-year starting salary that is equal to 105% of the average of every player's contract in the NBA. Now, this number is a bit more fluid. You'll notice that I have a range on the graphic. And the reason for this is right now, all that's available is the estimate of what they expect it to be. I will say over the course of history, the number tends to go up when they revise it at the end of the year. But you can feel comfortable knowing that Ty Jerome's first-year salary would be between $12 and $13 million. Now, does that mean that I believe that Ty Jerome will command $12 to $13 million in average annual value on an open marketplace? No, not necessarily. I am giving you that number because that is the ceiling of what the Cavaliers can offer. If somebody comes in from another team and says, Ty Jerome, we'll give you the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, well, then he's going to have to decide what's more important to him. $1 million and a half annually, or the continuity of staying with a contending Cavalier team. Do I think it's out of the question that he would leave over such a small amount of money? No. But my belief, personally, is that Ty Jerome will cost somewhere between the taxpayer mid-level exception, which is just shy of $6 million a year, and the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is significantly more at $14 million a year. My sweet spot would be somewhere between $7 and $9 million. I think he could push $10 million. But as we get into the next section about historical precedents and the market outlook, I think, if anything, you're going to come away feeling better about whatever negativity you had about the Cavaliers' ability to retain Ty Jerome. So let's pivot to historical precedent. Now, for historical precedent, what I did was I looked back over the past 3 seasons to find examples of players who would utilize the advantages of early bird rights to sign new deals with their teams, or perhaps to abandon their teams if the limitations were just too much. I went back first to the summer of 2022. In the summer of 2022, there were 2 veterans who remained with the teams that they were on by utilizing the advantages of early bird rights. Those guys were Bobby Portis of the Milwaukee Bucks and Nicholas Batum of the Clippers. Now, unlike the 2023 class, in the case of these 2, Portis and Batum, both of them found themselves playing for teams on short-term deals who would prove to be good fits. For Batum, he was on a massive deal in Charlotte that got bought out in the middle of the season, and he signed with the Clippers on a show-me deal in December of 2020. Then the following season ran back another 1-year deal, so he had only accrued about a year and a half of service with the Clippers by the time they wanted to commit to him. So they turned to early bird rights and signed him for a 2-year deal worth roughly $23 million. Now, the Bucks, on the other hand, Portis was the guy who came into the league in a situation as a first-round draft choice where he could have remained with the Bulls. They had his bird rights, but that didn't work out because he punched a teammate in the face and broke said face. So he bounced around in the middle portion of his 20s on deals that essentially were, again, show-me deals. 1-year deal with the Knicks, then another short-term deal, a 2-year deal with the Bucks. And when it was time to pay him, he was coming off a season where he placed in terms of 6th man of the year. I believe he finished 9th, and the Bucks gave him a 4-year, $48 million deal. And in the case of both Batum and Bobby Portis, their starting first-year salary on their new deal was the maximum allowable amount utilizing the 105% option of early bird rules. They both made $10.8 million in the first year of their new deals. Now, in the case of Batum, it was shorter. It was a 2-year deal. Portis got a full 4-year deal. But the rules say that it just has to be 2 years or more. So both those guys returned to their teams on deals that were the maximum allowable amount. And what you're going to find as I go through these summers is that with the lone exception of one player, everybody utilizes the 105% rule of the early bird options. Usually it's because these guys were on minimums. They were on show-me deals. The only time 175% of your previous contract works out is if your previous contract was fairly large. So let's move on to the summer of 2023. Now, in the summer of 2023, the guys who utilized early bird rights to sign new deals were a different type. They were young guys. They were guys who proved themselves as a second-round pick and an undrafted free agent, and then they returned to their teams on much more lucrative deals. But I would argue both the guys who used early bird rights to take the maximum allowable amount of money from their teams proved to be value contracts. Those guys were second-round pick of the New Orleans Pelicans, Herb Jones, and undrafted free agent Austin Reeves, who signed with the Lakers and proved to be a very capable NBA level. Now, I remember this summer vividly. I was hoping that the Spurs would throw a bag at Austin Reeves just to screw the Lakers, because similar to the Cavs, they were in a situation where if somebody had given them more money than they committed to Austin Reeves, they would have no ability to replace him. They'd have to turn to minimum level players. That's the situation we're in with Ty Jerome. So the fact that both these guys went back to their teams on deals whose first-year salaries were roughly $12 million, I think you can argue Herb Jones is one of the most valuable contracts in the NBA, and Austin Reeves is definitely a positive contract, a very movable deal if the Lakers chose to do so. So that's the summer of 2023. Now we turn to 2024, where we get both our first example of somebody who utilized the 175% option and the first example of a situation where someone was poached because the maximum allowable amount under either option was simply not enough. To the graphic. Kelly Oubre of the Philadelphia 76ers, a man who had joined the team on a minimum contract after leaving Charlotte and finding that the market was softer than he hoped it would be. Signs on a deal to prove himself, does in fact prove himself, and utilizing the 105% option, Philadelphia retained him. Now, this is one of the rare examples where they did not go to the ceiling of that amount. They were able to bring Kelly Oubre back at an amount of roughly $8 million. Now, they could have paid him up to $10.1 million, but they did not. So, while early bird was very beneficial to them, this was not an instance of them really having any outside threat of somebody to swoop in and give him a full non-taxpayer mid-level exception. The other guy who remained with his team utilizing early bird rights was Malik Monk. Now, Malik Monk is a fantastic sixth man. He made a lot of money, though. He was on a contract of roughly $10 million. So you can probably do this math in your head. 175% of $10 million is $17.5 million. And what do you know? His starting first-year salary on a new deal was exactly that, $17.4 million for Malik Monk. They maxed him out, and he was retained. He's the single example in the past 3 seasons of a player who was retained utilizing the 175% rule. Now, the last guy in this class is a cautionary tale. He's a man we know well. We saw him with the Knicks. We saw him again with the Oklahoma City Thunder, and that is a guy I've referenced on the podcast, Isaiah Hartenstein. He had signed a 2-year deal worth roughly $16 million with the New York Knicks following a successful season with the LA Clippers. Now, at the time, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm sure the Knicks wished they'd given him a 3-year deal because they wanted to keep him very badly. Unfortunately, the situation he was in was that his final year contract with the Knicks was just $9.2 million. That meant, utilizing the 175% option, his maximum deal was $16.1 million, and the 105% option was even worse because that would have only allowed them to pay him up to $10.2 million in first-year salary. Now, the deal he got had a first-year salary with Oklahoma City of $29 million. They had cap space. They gave him an offer far in excess of the maximum that the Knicks were allowed to pay him, and they lost him for nothing. So that brings us to today. I think we can come to certain conclusions when it comes to Ty Jerome. The 175% option is nearly worthless for the Cavaliers. It is such a small amount, they will almost certainly turn to some figure allowable utilizing the 105% of the NBA average annual salary option. Now, what that figure is, that's debatable. I think what's productive to do, though, is to turn to the free agent class of last summer just to get an idea of what the free agent backup point guard market commanded. Now, what you'll see on the screen in front of you is a list of every point guard who signed a deal in unrestricted free agency last year. I left off the people who were on what's called Exhibit 10 deals because most of those guys don't make it through training camp. But on this list, I calculated a few things. First of all, you'll notice the average annual value. There is a sharp drop after these first 3 guys. Tyrese Maxey, who signed a max, Emmanuel Quickley, who signed a very questionable $32.5 million average annual value deal with the Toronto Raptors, and Chris Paul, who got $10 million to be a stopgap, essentially, a transitionary point guard, a veteran presence, somebody to help guide the San Antonio Spurs into the competitive landscape. Now, across the rest of the league, you'll notice nobody. Chris Dunn was the next highest paid guard, and he happened to prove himself as a starter with the Clippers. But there's only 4 guys who proved themselves to be starters. So what I did was I calculated the average salary, first of all. Even with these outlier numbers of Maxey and Quickley, the average salary for a guard signing last season was $11 million. Then I broke it down to starters and backups because if Ty Jerome is perceived as a high-level backup, perhaps we should be looking to this number. The average backup point guard salary in last offseason's free agent class was just shy of $4 million. Now, do I believe Ty will make that little? No. I think if you look at this list, Ty Jerome is younger and better than the majority of people on here. But just look around. There's some proven names on here. Spencer Dinwiddie, Russell Westbrook, Tyus Jones. Tyus Jones was a guy who was coming off a $12.5, $13 million a year contract. He was very productive in Washington. He was just on a horrible team. He ended up settling for a minimum to go play in Phoenix and presumably showcase himself in hopes of getting a better deal in the future. But what I would take away from this is that for all the fears that somebody's going to go break the bank for a Ty Jerome, I think this should provide some comfort to you, because spending on a backup point guard is not something that proves to be a priority for most teams. It's only the risk here is that if Ty plays so well that people view him as a first option starter, they want to build their starting backcourt around him, and they're going to bring him in and they're going to pay him starter money. Well, then, yeah, if the average starter salary is around $20 million, is it inconceivable somebody would throw a non-taxpayer mid-level exception to him? No, but I think it's unlikely. Now, we've covered the math. We've covered the historical precedent. That brings me to my favorite part of this little video here, which is examining the realistic outlook of a market for Ty Jerome. And the most logical way to do that, I think, is this. If what I told you in the preceding part of this video was that the teams that pose real threats to us are ones who are in full possession of a non-taxpayer mid-level exception, the next logical question becomes, well, who will have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception? So, let's go to the market. As you can see here, I have laid out every non-Cavalier team in the league. We have a landscape of logos all inferior to our own Cavaliers, and what I'm going to do next is eliminate the ones who are projected to be above the luxury tax. Poof. Right there, 1/3 of the league is eliminated. Now, in a few select circumstances, teams like the Rockets, they have a team option on a $40 million plus contract in Fred VanVleet. That could change their circumstances. But in general, the teams that I've eliminated, you do not have to worry about. They are over the luxury tax at the start of next offseason, so they will not have a non-taxpayer mid-level exception available to them. That leaves roughly 2/3 of the league. I think the next way to logically whittle this list down is to look at the teams and figure out which ones have star point guards or very expensive backcourts and eliminate them. Because if you're going to commit a full non-taxpayer mid-level exception to a Ty Jerome, $14 million, you're certainly not going to do it in a situation where he is not utilized heavily. So, in doing that, I've eliminated these teams. Take a moment, look where the red X's are, and you decide for yourself if I eliminated teams reasonably. I think that I did. That leaves us with the following 7 teams. These squads are teams which will both have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception available to them and could potentially have interest in Ty Jerome. Now, again, this is a subjective analysis I'm making, but I'm about to make my case for each and every one of these squads to you in order of who I perceive to be the least viable threat to the most viable threat. Let's begin with a couple of teams that I am not worried about remotely. We begin with the Portland Trail Blazers. Now, why do they make this list? This is a team, despite their recent hot streak, who is in a position of rebuild. They do not have cap space per se, but they do have the non-taxpayer mid-level exception to utilize, and being a full $23 million away from the first apron. One important thing to remember throughout all of this is that if a team chooses to utilize more than the taxpayer mid-level exception, which is just shy of $6 million, they become hard capped at the first apron. They can't spend $1 over that figure. So the reason this is relevant is because you see that figure that says Portland is $23 million from the first apron. Let's say they committed $14 million of that to a Ty Jerome. That would mean that they have roughly $9 million remaining to fill out the rest of their roster, and they would be hard capped at that first apron. Now, that's not a problem for Portland because, as you can see, they currently have 13 players committed to contracts at the beginning of next offseason. They have just one spot left to fill. But the reason that I said the level of fear for the Portland Trail Blazers is a 1 for me is because they have young guys in their backcourt. One of them is committed to a very substantial deal in Anthony Simons, and the other, Scoot Henderson, he was a very high draft choice. they will want the young guys to work as much as possible. Do I think a team perceived to be rebuilding in the Portland Trailblazers is going to commit to a Ty Jerome as he's, 27, 28, 29, 30, as he heads towards that portion of his career? No. And more importantly, I think the reason I'm skeptical is because they only have one roster spot to work with. And that does not factor in things like draft choices. So do I think Ty Jerome fits there? No, primarily because I don't think they have the roster availability to really bring in anyone. I think that extra spot will be dedicated to somebody in the draft, and then they may wiggle around the margins. Let's go to the next team that I'm not threatened by, and that's the Utah Jazz. Now, the Utah Jazz are significantly far away from the first apron. $45 million. That means they could throw a full non-taxpayer mid-level exception at Ty Jerome, and there would be no real risk of them approaching hard cap issues. The reason why their level of fear is a 1. By the way, this is a scale of 1 to 10 if it's not indicated by the graphic that you're looking at. But the reason I'm not scared of Portland or Utah is because Utah already has 14 players under contract heading into next year. That doesn't factor in draft picks or anybody. So they will need to offload people who are they committed to pay in order just to squeeze a guy in. And when you look at the point guards under contract for them, now I take some liberties sometimes with combo guards who ball handle a lot. And that's when you'll see me do things like, say, half a point guard. But Colin Sexton, Isaiah Collier, Keontae George, those are all young guys. 2 of them are on rookie deals. And Colin Sexton is on a pretty valuable deal. I don't think it's unreasonable to make shy of $20 million for his skill set. So do I think they're going to try to shoehorn in a Ty Jerome to a team that's just at the start of a rebuild? No, I don't. But it should be noted that in addition to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, they also have $14 million in cap space. They could throw something in the middle here and do it reasonably because they don't have the constraints of capped out teams that other people do. But despite that, I am not remotely threatened by the Utah Jazz. Let's move to the Washington Wizards, who just recently took on a ton of salary in Chris Middleton and Marcus Smart. They are a team with just one open roster spot on their squad next year, and I gave them credit for 3.5 guards under contract. Jordan Poole making $32 million, Marcus Smart, who came over from Memphis, making $22 million, Bub Carrington, their rookie, and A.J. Johnson, a rookie they acquired from the Milwaukee Bucks in said Middleton salary dump. Do I think they're going to throw Ty Jerome into that mix when, again, they're a terrible team? They may want to preserve space because if they can keep some cap space, they can keep assuming terrible contracts during this rebuilding for assets, essentially, draft assets. And with 13 guys under contract, they're likely going to be top lotto team. I mean, they may be the worst team in the league, and that will give them top 4 lotto odds. They'll finish with a top 3 pick in all likelihood. So I am not threatened by the Blazers. I'm not threatened by the Jazz, and I'm not threatened by the Wizards. Now we start to tick up the scale. Onward to the Golden State Warriors. How much do they concern me? Well, I think the most troubling part here is Ty has a history there. Now, of course, they let him go, and he signed away to us on a minimal deal. So presumably, if they wanted him, they could have kept him. But most of this assessment, this level of fear being a 4, is because they only have 9 players under contract at present. And the only guys who I would consider viable offensive initiators are a Steph Curry or Brandon Pajemski. They could use some more assistance back there. It's a market that he's familiar with. I don't think this is that realistic, but with only 9 guys under contract and the non-taxpayer mid-level exception to use, they'll have to fill 5 roster spots. And they don't have that many guards when you compare it to some of the other teams that we have out there. So I put my level of fear at a 4. But I am very skeptical of the notion that a team that didn't give Ty a real chance the first time around would be where he would go back to. Who knows, though? Maybe things ended on good terms. Now, we move on to the next team, the Miami Heat. Now, this team is an interesting one because while they have 13 players under contract, which means they only really have one spot to do anything with, they only have 1 point guard under contract, and he's over 30 years of age. This is a team that desperately needs some real offensive initiation and lead guard play. And in that regard, Ty Jerome could be a good fit. because they brought in a lot of pieces in this Wiggins deal. They have Hero, they have Bam. This is not a team on a teardown. This is a team trying to kind of reshuffle their pieces on the fly. My skepticism, though, is that they don't have cap space. They only have the exception to work with, and being just $15 million from the first apron, would they commit that entire thing to a Ty Jerome, hard cap themselves, and put themselves in a situation where basically during the season, any maneuver would be difficult because they'd be working against that hard cap? Now, I think the market is desirable for players. I think the fact that he doesn't have much competition in terms of true point guards on that roster, that could be desirable. So for that reason alone, I gave them a score of 5. I think it is difficult to figure out how they would fit him in when they only have one spot that's still up in the air, but I don't think it's impossible. Next, we move to the Sacramento Kings. They share the same rank on the level of fear scale, and that's a 5. Why is that? Well, they have a lot of open roster spots. Currently, heading into next summer, they only have 8 players under contract. 1 center, 4 forwards, 3 guards. Of the guards under contract, I think 2 of them are more what I would call 2 guards in Zach LaVine and Malik Monk. And then Devin Carter, their first-round draft pick this prior draft, he's the only other guy on the roster. Now, that's substantial money they have committed to the guard position. Do I think that they would throw a $14 million salary at Ty Jerome? I don't, because, again, if they did that, that would hard cap them, and that would mean with, 5 roster spots left, they would have essentially $10 million to do it with. Do I think they would do that? No. They're also going to have a first-round pick. They have to work in. I'm skeptical. I don't think it's impossible, though. If you were to ask me, even though I have both Miami and Sacramento at a 5, I think Miami is a much more logical fit for a Ty Jerome. And that brings me to the number 1 most feared team on the market next year, and that is the Brooklyn Nets. Now, this is just a softball across the plate, smash it out of the park. Brooklyn is a team in complete disarray, in a total rebuild. They have gutted their payroll to the tune of a projected $92 million in cap space as we currently stand. Now, there's things that will complicate that, the restricted free agency of Daron Sharp and a Cam Thomas, but as it sits now, they likely won't have any true point guards under contract. D'Angelo Russell is an expiring contract, and Cam Thomas is much more of a guy who goes out and get his than really a true offensive initiator. With only 7 players under contract, that leaves 7 roster spots to be filled. Now, why might Ty be interested in this? Well, it's his hometown. It's a team devoid of point guards, and the Brooklyn Nets are going to have to spend money. They need to get to a salary floor. So while I think they'll keep a reasonable amount of cap space to be able to continue to do these trade maneuvers where they absorb bad money, I don't think they'll spend it all. And so for that reason, I could see them offering Ty Jerome a short-term deal, something similar to what like a Detroit did with Tobias Harris. They overpaid him, but they did it as a way on a very short-term deal to keep flexibility. And for that reason, I don't think it's impossible to come up with a scenario in your mind where the Brooklyn Nets throw a bag at Ty Jerome to try to bring him back to Brooklyn, bring him back to New York City. All that being said, I just gave you 7 teams. 4 of them were below a 5 for me. 3 of them were a 5 and above. Miami, Sacramento, Brooklyn. If I tell you those are the realistic threats to poach Ty Jerome, how scared are you? I would argue I'm not very scared. Brooklyn is really the biggest wild card amongst them, but the rest of the teams, some serious compromises would have to be made to bring in a Ty Jerome. And as much as we love him, I want you to ask yourself, a point guard approaching 30 who's been a career backup, who has just 1 season of immense production under his belt, how willing are you to commit long-term, fairly big money to that person, especially when you're one of these teams in a state of rebuild? So I hope what you've taken away from this video is a few things. First of all, the Cavaliers absolutely can retain Ty Jerome. I would say it's more important now than ever because as a second apron team, they will not have the ability to replace a player of Ty Jerome's value with anything more than a minimum contract. Secondly, I would say that based on what we've seen from the backup point guard market, you may find that the final price tag is lower than you might have expected. We've seen lots of very good backup point guards make less than $10 million. So could somebody come out and steal Ty Jerome? Absolutely. But ask yourself this. If nobody did it for Herb Jones, or if nobody did it for Austin Reeves, who I think arguably were more proven players at the time their free agency hit, will somebody do it for Ty Jerome, who's older, who's been around longer, and who has a shorter track record of a breakout season? Those guys did it over a couple of years. Ty Jerome essentially has all the games he's accumulated where Karis LeVert hasn't been in the lineup. So I would say you should feel good about Ty Jerome's free agency. I think the Cavaliers will retain him. I think they should. And I think ultimately, while we may not know the final price tag, I would put my money on him coming in somewhere shy of $10 million in first-year salary. I expect him to land 7 to 9. Now, we'll look back at this at some point and we'll figure out, was I too optimistic? Was I too cynical? But my main hope with this video is that people stop treating Ty Jerome's season like there's no way that they will retain him after this. It is very much possible. In fact, I would say it's probable. I'm Bob Schmidt. This is a YouTube video for the Fear the Fro podcast. If you haven't checked out the podcast, please, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts, it's Fear the Fro. Thank you. Till the next time.